Welcome back. This is interval video number 3. And we've been discussing changing the size of an interval by a half step, major turning into minor, minor turning into major. We're creating this chart, and remember, any vertical line, when you cross a vertical line, an interval is changing by a size by a half step. So a major interval made a half step smaller becomes minor. We're going to add to this. Let's put perfect underneath this. And then we're also going to put diminished over here. And augmented over here. Okay, we still have vertical lines. Do you want me to fix that? I want to fix that. We'll just make it a little nicer. Okay. Our vertical lines, again, represent the change of half step. So what that means is, if you're on a perfect interval, like a perfect fifth, and you make it a half step larger, it becomes an augmented fifth. If you have a perfect fifth and you make it a half step smaller, it becomes a diminished fifth. And again, we can modify these intervals by changing either the top note or the bottom note. I'm writing a perfect fifth here. That's D and A in the bass clef. How do I know it's perfect? Look, I even typed this out, because the top note is in the major key of the bottom note. A is in the key of D, so I know that it is a perfect fifth. That is a perfect fifth because A is in the key of D. And I know that fifths can be perfect, but they cannot be major. So again, it's major or perfect if the top note's in the key of the bottom note. All right, so A is a perfect fifth. A perfect fifth above D. Now I can just write a whole bunch of D's and A's, and we can just do all kinds of crazy things to them and make them all sorts of intervals. You tell me. I'm going to put a sharp on this top note. I'm raising the top note of that one. I'm going to lower the bottom note of this one. I'm going to raise the bottom note of this one. I'm going to lower the top note of that one. So what's happening to these intervals? That's the question. When I raise the top note of this perfect fifth, well, the notes are further apart. This note has just moved up. The note head didn't move on the staff, but its position on the keyboard changed. Here's D, here's A, here's D, here's A sharp. See how that got larger? But it's still a fifth, because these notes are still a fifth apart on the staff. The staff gives you quantities, the keyboard gives you qualities. The staff will never lie, it will never let you down. It is consistent when it comes to those qualities. Look at all these different versions of the same fifth. These are all fifths, but they're all different qualities, different notes on the bottom, different notes on the top. Okay, so again, we raised that top note. The interval got a half step larger. So we started with a perfect interval. It got larger, and so we crossed this vertical line, and now the interval is augmented. So this is an augmented fifth. Looking at this interval, it was a perfect fifth when it was D and A natural. Now it's D flat and A. So what happened? The bottom note was lowered by a half step, which means the interval got larger. Again, it's still a fifth on the staff, But now instead of D to A, it is D flat to A half step larger. You take a perfect interval, make it a half step larger, and it becomes augmented. So right now, this is a very common thing. I've seen it 1,000 times over the years. It's very common for you to think, oh, sharp means augmented, flat means diminished. Nope. Look at this. That's got a sharp on it, and it became augmented. This has got a flat on it, and it became augmented. So don't think that sharps and flats all by themselves create diminished or augmented qualities. Think about the size of the interval. Perfect fifth becomes augmented fifth because it gets larger. Perfect fifth becomes augmented fifth because it gets larger. Lower the bottom note, raise the top note. I think you can see where we're going. Look at the next one. I have A here, D was there, but now it's D sharp. What's happened to the bottom note? The bottom note was raised by a half step. D on the keyboard to A is now D sharp to A. This interval got smaller. And as you might guess, smaller means diminished. When we go from a perfect interval, whoops! Perfect interval to diminished. Half step smaller, we're crossing this line. Let's look at the next one. It was D and A natural. Now we put a flat on the top note. That lowers the top note. That also makes it a diminished fifth. Again, sharps and flats by themselves don't mean augmented or diminished. It's the size of the interval that determines that. Got it? Let's talk about the dynamic intervals, majors and minors. Things we would normally associate with majors and minors like seconds or sixths. Let's look at a second. Let's look at the interval A to B. Now let's make it G to A. When we write a second, by the way, we can't write the note heads directly on top of each other. They have to be offset a little bit. Okay, A is in the key of G. This is a major second. Major seconds are whole step. Minor seconds are half step. So I see this whole step on the keyboard here, G to A. That's a major second. I know it's a second on the staff because they're one notch apart from each other. Now if I take this major interval, G to A, and I lower the bottom note, what just happened to my position on the keyboard? G to A now is G flat to A. It's larger, but it's still a second. And this is a mind blower. When you're looking at the keyboard, you're like, oh my gosh, that looks like a third. Might look like a third on the keyboard, but again, the staff keeps you honest. Look at it on the staff. That is a second. This was a major second. We lowered the bottom note. Now it is an augmented second. So go back to the chart. If I have a major interval and I make it a half step larger, it becomes augmented. If I have a minor interval and I make it a half step smaller, take one of our favorite minor thirds, good old A and C. By the way, all minor thirds are 1.5 steps. When I look at A and C on the keyboard, I see 1.5 steps. That's a great thing to write down. Quickly, write this down in your notes right now. All minor seconds are a half step. All major seconds are a whole step. All minor thirds are 1.5 steps. All major thirds are 2 whole steps. Go back 30 seconds and listen to that 20 times and write it down. Memorize that. Okay, so here's our favorite minor third in the world. Good old A to C. Well, it's one of my favorite minor thirds. Now, what happens if I make this A sharp to C? What just happened to that interval? Well, it was A to C, minor third. Now it's A sharp to C. Looks like a whole step. And on the piano, it is a whole step. But on the staff, it's still A. It's still A sharp and C. So on the staff, you can still see this is still a third. But it's a smaller, by half step smaller third than the minor third was. So therefore, it is a diminished third. Look at the chart. If I have a minor interval, I make it a half step smaller. It becomes diminished. All right. Enjoy. Watch it over and over again.